Welcome to the presentation of the paper Lemmatization, Etymology and Information Overload on English and Swedish editions of Wiktionary. In this paper, I will account for the differences in the entry layout structure by discussing the different approaches to etymology and the headword. I will argue that the approach adopted by the English Wiktionary is suitable for an extensive dictionary project with a lot of non-semantic information, especially elaborate etymological information. The approach chosen by the Swedish Wiktionary, on the other hand, is suitable for smaller projects which have not yet acquired the status of elaborate all-purpose dictionary, including detailed etymologies. The Swedish Wiktionary can be viewed as a project in a transition from a smaller, mainly semantically oriented dictionary to an all-purpose dictionary. Let me begin by briefly introducing Wiktionary. Wiktionary is a user-generated wiki project with the goal of building a universal dictionary covering all words in all languages. It exists currently in 170 language editions, and the English edition of it is currently one of the fastest growing lexicographic projects with great potential. It has already received some academic interest, such as the paper of Meyer and Gurevich from 2012, which I highly recommend for a general introduction to the project. When talking about Wiktionary, it is important to differentiate between language editions in different languages on the one hand and languages covered on each of these editions on the other. For example, the focus of this paper is primarily on two editions of Wiktionary, the English and the Swedish, but all editions have the goal of including words in all languages, both living, extinct, and reconstructed. The difference is, above all, that the words on the English Wiktionary, for instance, are defined using the English language, whereas all words are defined using the Swedish language on the Swedish Wiktionary. However, both editions should include words in, say, both English and Swedish, Russian, Finnish, etc. Wiktionary also has the goal of being an all-purpose dictionary, that is, including all there is to say about the word, including its semantic, pragmatic, and formal properties, such as pronunciation and grammar, as well as etymology. Of course, because different editions have different sizes of the editor community, they also vary greatly in the amount of languages covered. As such, English Wiktionary has some 6,000 active editors and 2.6 million lexical entries distributed across thousands of languages, whereas Swedish Wiktionary only has 170 active editors, resulting in 356,000 entries. This paper does not deal with the quality or the quantity of the coverage on either edition. Instead, it scrutinizes how the entry layout presents the content of an entry to the reader. The focus of the study is, above all, homonymous and polysemous words, because it is in such words that the different approaches adopted by the English and the Swedish editions result in rather different entry layouts. Let us now have a look at how entries on identical words can appear on both editions. This is the English Wiktionary entry of the Swedish word stuga, meaning small house or a cottage. It organizes the information around different sections, such as alternative forms, pronunciation, etymology, the definitions under the part of speech, and the grammatical information. Etymologically and semantically, this word is rather simple. That is, it only has one closely related group of meanings, which share one origin. This is the same entry on the Swedish Wiktionary. You can see that it is semantically more elaborate, listing 4 senses instead of 2. The entry lacks non-semantic information, such as pronunciation. The etymology section is equally elaborate as the one at the English Wiktionary, but it lacks a section of its own, rather being given beneath the last definition. Here we can see a comparison between the two versions. To the left, you see the English Wiktionary entry, and you can see that the etymology is placed above the definitions. And to the right, you can see the Swedish Wiktionary entry, which places the etymology below the definition. As already mentioned, the entry above is etymologically rather simple. Here we see an entry on the Swedish word ask, which in Swedish has two meanings: name of a tree, ash in English, and the meaning small box. The English entry to the left provides one etymology section, since the word is polysemous. The sense small box developed from the tree sense because of the materials such boxes were historically made of. The Swedish entry to the right, again, lacks an etymology section, but provides the etymological information under each definition, stating that the sense small box has the same etymology as the primary sense. Now let's have a look at an entry of a homonymous word, that is, a word that looks the same from the point of view of the contemporary state of the language, but has senses going back to different etymologies. The word is English boar. The images you see contain a pair of entries I constructed in order to demonstrate the differences on one screen, since the actual entries are too lengthy. These constructed entries contain identical information and are made according to the rules of the entry layout of both editions. One striking difference is that when dealing with an etymologically complex word, and given that the amount of information is identical, the entry at the English Wiktionary becomes visually much larger and takes up more screen space than that of the English Wiktionary. This is due to the fact that the English Wiktionary splits the definitions primarily between etymologies, and this word has 3 distinct etymologies, but also between parts of speech. The Swedish Wiktionary skips the etymology sections altogether and only divides words according to formal properties, such as part of speech. Etymologies are provided under the definitions. To summarize, the ways in which both editions do lemmatization, the English Wiktionary groups senses based primarily on shared etymology, whereas the Swedish Wiktionary groups them exclusively based on formal properties. This follows a tradition within Swedish lexicography, which is adopted, for instance, in the Swedish academic word list, and often referred to in Sweden as the lemmalexi model. In order to assess the advantages and disadvantages of these approaches, we must try to define the intended audience. Who is Wiktionary for? The Wiktionary itself refuses to answer this question, simply claiming it's for all. Therefore, I have attempted to outline 3 main groups of users. Language learners, which are interested in core and frequent vocabulary, native speakers of a given language that look up for, so to speak, difficult words and less frequent vocabulary, and readers interested in word etymologies. This could also boil down to only 2 groups, that is, users interested in word etymologies and users that are not interested in word etymologies. I believe that this typology is more useful for assessing the lemmatization approaches and the information overload that comes from them. For example, than one based on consulting situations, traditionally, such as reception, production, or translation. Both the language learners and the native speakers can be engaged in all of these situations, and they are all equally affected by the lemmatization approaches. Gauss and Tarp introduce a typology of data overload in web-based or digital dictionaries, which can be used to contextualize how the presented choices on lemma entry affects users. They differentiate between concrete data overload and perceptive data overload. The former, the concrete data overload, means that too much information that is not requested by the user is presented, whereas the latter, the perceptive data overload, means that information is not presented optimally, for instance, distributing the screen space in a way that is not benefiting the lookup process. It should be noted that only the perceptive data overload that is, not distributing screen space in an optimal manner, can be dealt with on Wiktionary, since there is no such thing as too much information on Wiktionary. The universal goal of the project implies that eventually everything that there is to say about a word should be included. Now the question is, what would happen if someone decided to add elaborate etymological information to a highly homonymous word, such as the Swedish boss that we can see here? Right now it lacks any etymological information at the Swedish Wiktionary. Some of the translations of this word into English are base or boss, like a boss on the work, but there are more translations. This word goes back to at least 6 different etymologies, probably more. An etymology doesn't only need to include an ancestral word form or a word in another language from which it was borrowed. It can also include explanatory text about semantic shifts and parallels that connect the sense in question to other items. All this requires considerable amount of screen space. In the case of the Swedish Wiktionary, all this information would be added structurally between the definitions, breaking them up, whereas the English Wiktionary would have them hierarchically and visually separate. One of my main conclusions is therefore that the choice to visually separate etymologies from the definitions adopted by the English Wiktionary is a more optimal solution for a dictionary that has both the potential and the ambition to include such elaborate etymological information. This does mean, of course, that the lookup process for the readers interested in non-etymological information only becomes more cumbersome, but it also frees up space for elaborate etymological sections without making the microstructure too messy, as would be the case if all that information would be inserted between the definitions. At the same time, as long as the entries at the Swedish Wiktionary do not include too much etymological information, as we see here, the choice to skip separate etymology sections probably benefits the non-etymologically interested readers, since the lookup process becomes easier without words being split across several etymology sections. This advantage then turns into disadvantage as soon as too much etymological information is inserted between the definitions, unless the problem is resolved in the future by, for example, introducing a fold, unfold, or spoiler function that hides etymological information by default, as this was suggested by one reviewer of the current paper. There is another difference in the layout structure, not immediately connected to etymology, that affects the overload in the readers that is discussed. And that is the different degree of visual separation between semantic and non-semantic information. Regardless of the addition, derived terms can and should be linked to a Wiktionary. In a language such as Swedish, any given term can have a great many compounds which correspond to several separate words in English. Here we can see the word stad, meaning city or town in Swedish, but it can also mean place in general. The English Wiktionary places all derived terms in a separate section below, taking it away from the definitions, which must be considered a good thing, keeping in mind that readers usually don't request all that information. It is mostly there to document the language in its completeness. The Swedish edition, on the other hand, places the excessively lengthy list of compounds in the middle of the definitions, which must impede a successful lookup for any type of users. To conclude, both editions suffer from perceptive data overload, but it comes from different sources. Since the English Wiktionary has generally very elaborate entries, it has to split the content between different sections, which impedes the lookup for users not interested in etymology or in being able to see complete lists of related or derived terms. However, this also frees up space for compilation of elaborate etymology sections, which serves well users interested in just that. The perceptive overload at the Swedish Wiktionary, on the other hand, is kept to a minimum as long as entries do not have too much etymological information, but it quickly increases with the increasing complexity of an entry. In the event of the non-semantic contents of the Swedish Wiktionary expanding in the future, the overload could be expected to increase to the point of becoming incompatible with a formal grammatical approach, and the greater separation of semantic and non-semantic information should be considered. More research is, of course, needed to confirm the somewhat speculative findings of this paper. For instance, using eye trackers could be beneficial for determining the time required by the users to arrive at successful lookups under each approach. Thanks for listening.